tobacco industry knows that it's a dying business. They've got to replace it because cigarettes are not where it's at. I think they've done really well on the pivot to snus and the snus type pouch products now, and that's done well for them. But I think they realize they need to move on from the beyond nicotine kind of initiative into other segments, and cannabis poses a really interesting segment for them to look at. So, it's not surprising to see beyond BAT, other players also very seriously look at the segment.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of The Dime. I'm Brian Fields. With me, as always, is Kellen Finney. And this week, we got a very special guest, Deepak Anand, Global Business Consultant Strategist. Deepak, thanks for taking the time. How are you doing today?
Good, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Excited to have you here. Kellen, how are you doing?
Doing really well. Really excited to talk to Deepak and really excited to dive into the global landscape. How are you, Brian?
I'm stoked. There are so many topics, and I know we were picking Deepak's brain before we got started, and it was like, we should probably just record because there are so many moving pieces of this puzzle, and starting to put it all together is really becoming interesting because tobacco is making a little more noise. The European market's starting to come on noise, and I think eventually we're going to get some clarity of how this is all going to shake out because what's happening here currently in America needs a little help, and it seems like the ocean is parting for some of the other players to come in. So Deepak, before we get started, I'm not going to put you on the East Coast, West Coast. Let's dive right in. Talk to us about how you found your way to the cannabis space.
Yeah, so look, I got into it accidentally. I was dealing with a lot of underinsured Americans, actually, that used to come fill their prescription drugs in Canada by the busloads. That model online and started kind of getting into the regulatory space by accident, which then got me involved with Health Canada and working on the policy regulatory side of things generally. And, when cannabis was getting legalized, kind of the government reached out to me and said, hey, would you help us set up sort of an industry association? So that's kind of how I got my feet wet in cannabis.
Perfect. So then take us through some of the clients that you work with, how that works, and kind of the roles and responsibilities that you help have them handle.
Yeah, look, so over the last almost decade now that I've been in cannabis, I've worked with, companies that are large CPG companies that are either interested in the space, looking to understand the space, or are very tactile kind of, operators in North America that are interested in obviously first getting licensed, but then eventually getting down the regulatory pathway into the various aspects of the businesses that we now see them in. So I work with companies that are all shapes and sizes, brands looking to enter international markets, Canadian cultivators looking to expand into places like Australia and Europe, European companies looking to import products in from around the world, and again, CPG companies that are targeting the space. So that's sort of my portfolio or suite of clients, if you will, Brian.
So those CPG companies, though, they're coming with a light understanding of, hey, we see this as an opportunity to diversify our revenue, maybe grow the revenue in some ways. We've got a product portfolio we think fits in. Is it more of where do we fit into the puzzle piece, or should we do an acquisition, dive right in, and accelerate as fast as we can?
Well, that's just it, right? Just at the first level, just understanding first and foremost risk. I think we're all so embedded into the cannabis industry that we still don't understand that there still is a great deal of risk. And by risk, I mean both stigma and risk. Of course, there's the stigma element of, a large CPG company that has a household name trying to get into this industry. It's certainly something that I see, and I work with executives on just helping them understand what are the myths of cannabis and what is fact, right? And I think the advantage of operating from a federally legal G7 jurisdiction like Canada is that we've had now under our belt 5+ years of legalization where we can actually look back and say, the world really hasn't ended, the sky hasn't fallen. So it's great to be able to, from this vantage point, be able to advise people on, what those myths and facts are around cannabis legalization. So that's, Brian, where I actually start a lot of the conversations. Inevitably, you've got a board member that is concerned about cannabis, what about driving, what about, all of those aspects. So that's the first element of that. And then the second element is just understanding the exact regulatory pathway. Like, what's our right to win is something I get asked a lot of times. So it's really those two pieces at a very high level that I'm advising on to begin with.
Has the conversation changed over the course of the decade that you've been involved? Is it from managing expectations to now a lot more grounded in what they're looking to accomplish when they are evaluating the space?
Absolutely. I think they've started to look at like the sector, and they look at the sector on from a very mature perspective, right? It's not just about launching a product and putting it on the market, which again, I think, cannabis companies, at least Canadian cannabis companies, that's what they've been doing for a long time is, just put something on the market, launch a pre-roll and actually get it out without looking at consumer safety, without looking at, product efficacy. No one's really having those detailed conversations. They may be happening in very isolated, very minuscule kind of levels, not at the scale of what some of these large companies look at. So it's refreshing for me to have somebody come to me that looks at and ask those questions around safety, efficacy, potency, those sorts of things, right? And we know with molecules, particularly like CBD, you can put 1,000 milligrams of CBD into something, but the bioavailability in the body is very low. So the absorption actually doesn't mean anything. So, that's the kind of conversation that I'm having with a lot of these guys, which is very interesting.
Do some of the conversations end up being like, why are there all these struggles, or are they aware of the chaos that the environment currently is?
Yeah, I think it started off with a bit of FOMO. I think what you saw early days in cannabis with, the U.S. beverage companies were probably most guilty of this, right? Is that FOMO of like, we need to get into the sector, we're missing out, valuations are going through the roof. You saw a bunch of money come through into Canada. That has now settled. And I think, in other industries observing this are not, immune to that or naive to that. They've certainly picked up on that and said, okay, I guess the longer I wait to put my money into this, the better it's actually going to be for me because valuations are coming down, things are getting more realistic. We're starting to understand companies that are managed well versus what revenue they're generating. So I think we're at that point of the conversation now where people have picked up on some of that initial kind of FOMO and realized that it wasn't really much FOMO. It was, the wait and see approach has actually worked well. So that's where those things are at.
One of the elements that these large-scale CPG companies have are resources, right? They're able to utilize these resources for persuasion in certain areas, maybe from a lobbyist standpoint, or for acquiring assets from a down market. So is one of the elements that you're consulting on is helping to utilize those resources in order to kind of set the stage for how they can successfully access the market?
Yeah, absolutely. It's accessing the market, understanding sort of what the market's looking for, and again, the market's not a one size fits all approach, right? And we'll certainly chat about that because depending on regulation and jurisdiction, there's a lot of things that are very, very different, right? We look at North America or the US or Canada as one market, but then when you look at the cannabis market on a global basis, it's literally hundreds of different markets, right? Like what applies to Denmark is the exact opposite from what happens in Germany, and then Australia and Israel are completely different. And it gets very challenging when you're a cannabis cultivator in Canada or anywhere, really looking at how do I tackle all of these international global markets. And it's a regulatory strategy that is unique to each and every market. We're not at that stage of the international game yet that we've got harmonized regulations across the board where, cannabis flower has a monograph and everyone follows that monograph and, people understand, the harmonization conversation. We're not there yet. So a lot of my work is just advising that aspect.
How do you go about like kind of focusing your clients with like this massive information overload and like next thing you know they're looking at a county in Colorado versus Denmark, like the rules are different, Australia, and then how do you kind of like keep them focused on specific goals through that and be like, okay, this market isn't for us, this market is, like talk us through some of that strategy.
Yeah, I think it's, a lot of this is just around understanding what is the strategy, right? And I think, again, we're at that stage of the game now where it's no longer like I've got $150 million to deploy, where do I put it? The conversation is about like, we've got a business that we run, whatever it is that we produce. Is it possible to get cannabis into kind of what we already understand and do super well? And is there a way to integrate that into us? Or do we need to completely think outside the box, right? So it's really starting at that basic high-level strategy of what is it that you want to accomplish, right? And we're seeing, at least, with some of the tobacco companies, we're starting to see that really flash out, right? Like if you look at British American Tobacco and Organigram, they've got something called a PDC, which is a product development corporation, where they've got people from the UK and from BAT's ecosystem actually seconded to Moncton, New Brunswick, where they're actually working on cannabis-specific products. And the Canadian market's a great testing ground. I mean, it's certainly not a sizable market really in the grand scheme of things on a global basis, but it's a great testing ground to be able to look at vapes and to be able to look at, ingestible products and how does that interact. So, if I'm British American Tobacco, I understand, let's just hypothetically say pouches or snus products that are really popular across the world now. How do I actually look at putting that in, right? So, and I think the Product Development Corporation, as an example, allows them a sandbox to be able to play in and get that knowledge, right? So, and you've certainly seen the OGI announcements, including most recently, they're really making headways. And I think that's quite similar with tobacco and other CPG companies across the board.
Yeah, the beverage company for sure is a big step, especially since we've seen the big beverage boom. I'm curious how that fits into the bigger portfolio. Maybe that's just them taking an opportunity, a big swing at the puzzle, or if they've got a larger kind of runway of like, this is the first step. We've got two others. We want to maybe consolidate this market because we think this could be a big dent into big alcohol.
Yeah, I think, Brian, they're really trying to understand each category in every segment. If you ask anyone in the industry, hemp-derived kind of THC beverages is where it's at. Like, everybody seems to be on that. Curaleaf's, you recently saw some moves on there. So, people aren't naive to that. And I think having Organigram that has a really high level of understanding about the business certainly helps with that, right? So I think if I'm Organigram, I'm like, well, it's great that I've got this investment that allows me to sandbox things with BAT, but I also have shareholder returns and deliverables to give. And I think the most recent acquisition that they did, for example, of the collective project beverages, I think that was a great way to be able to generate some serious revenue, also to be able to put their foot in really into the US market, right? So it allowed OGI as a Canadian company to actually get their foot in the door into that massive US market, and quite frankly, into a segment that's booming right now, which is the hemp-derived THC beverages.
Do you think like that from like a hierarchy standpoint, British American Tobacco wants Organigram to be in this market and it's kind of like a top-down approach, or do you think there's not as strategic of an alignment of there's a lot of trust from them? They said, listen, take advantage of this, grow the revenue, grow the business, this is how it goes, and if it benefits BAT in the long run, that's good as well.
Yeah, I think that's very much the case. I mean, obviously, I don't think, Organigram on its own makes decisions. There's a number of board members that actually are on the OGI board that are actually placed there by British American Tobacco. So it's not like the strategies are completely different. Having said that, obviously, Organigram needs to run its own business. And we're seeing this, beyond British American Tobacco as well. If you look at the Altria Kronos investment, you look at Philip Morris International, there's a bunch of the tobacco players that are very active. Japan Tobacco also, albeit been very quiet. They're certainly all those players are very active in the sector and the segment. And I think if you look at it, guys, it's, the tobacco industry knows that it's a dying business. They've got to replace it because cigarettes are not where it's at. I think they've done really well on the pivot to snus and the snus type pouch products now, and that's done well for them. But I think they realize they need to move on from the beyond nicotine kind of initiative into other segments, and cannabis poses a really interesting segment for them to look at. So, it's not surprising to see beyond BAT, other players also very seriously look at the segment.
Do you think that they're going to look at like the agricultural portion of the industry just because it pairs with like the traditional cultivation of tobacco? Do you think that's where like most of them are going to kind of hyper focus trying to get into the space?
I don't think it's lost on them that, there are still efficiencies, and we were chatting a little bit about this earlier, to still be had on the cultivation manufacturing side, right? I think there's still more efficiencies to be had there. There's certainly value in proprietary genetics. I mean, they obviously understand that from the tobacco crop. Cannabis is yet just another crop, but they understand the value of genetics and IP and, having some of the important things. I haven't really seen anything that's public, at least, that talks about that in a lot of detail, but it's not lost on them that that's an area. And again, Organigram is a cultivator also, right? They do cultivate products in New Brunswick. So, I'm sure the PDC there is quite involved in what's happening on the cultivation side.
They also are completely lost in the fact that the cannabis companies are in the absolute dumps, right? They're getting absolutely slaughtered. They're not doing well, to put it lightly. Right. But that is an opportunity in its own self for potential alignment, for potential kind of consolidation, which the industry likely needs in some aspects, right? To start consolidating down, for companies to start doing with a USP percentage. Do you think we're trending towards a consolidation effort where a lot of these markets are starting to get tightened up and the companies that can be, one should be one?
Yeah, you've certainly seen that, Brian. I mean, if you look again earlier this year, Organigram acquired a company called Motif Labs out of Canada, and they were really the number one kind of vape company that was doing cannabis vapes in this market. And so, that alone made OGI kind of the largest licensed producer by market share, right? And so they're definitely starting to look at that segment and that side of things and look at M&A. I think there's more consolidation to be had. I don't think we're done hearing about it, but certainly the valuations of companies are getting more attractive. I think what you're already starting to see now is a shift of people that have market share, that have good businesses, that have smart business plans and are executing on that versus companies that are still struggling a bit. And so I think it's the guys that are doing things well that I think most of the larger players are looking at, whether it be CPG or whether it even be cannabis companies that are looking at consolidation. I think you'll see more of it in the sector. A market that I'm really excited about is Germany because it's just insane the amount of growth that we're seeing in that market. And it's only a matter of time, in my opinion, that you'll start to see M&A kind of really pick up. I think right now things are too hot and valuations probably need to come down a little bit, but it's a market that I'm watching very closely from an M&A standpoint.
Talk to us about Germany. Is it more of like organic companies from within Germany that are kind of driving it, or is it like a mix of external companies? I know like the only company in Europe from a US standpoint is Curaleaf, but a lot of Canadian companies are over there in Europe as well. So like what's really like the companies driving the industry right now in Germany?
Maybe I'll give you some quick hits before that. I'll give you a bit of the market. So, Germany's medical cannabis market is really set to 3x by 2027, approaching about the 2 billion euro valuation. We've gone from 567 million as euros in 2024 to being closer to, the 1 billion mark by the end of this year and 2.2 billion by 2027. That's a 3x growth, which is quite significant. And remember, again, this is only the medical market, right? What happened on April 1 of last year was Germany basically made cannabis not be a narcotic on the medical side. So it was a very severely, highly regulated narcotic substance, much like the schedules we see in the US, where it was controlled. They took it off that control and basically said it's like any other pharmaceutical. And what that allowed companies that are in the market to do is set up telemedicine platforms and basically be able to attract patients that want to come in to be able to prescribe this product. And so you're seeing a lot of telemedicine growth. In parallel to that, you have this sort of quasi-decriminalization, which is the pillar 2 of the legalization approach. It started with being like a Canada-style, federal recreational program. Very quickly, they realized that was not going to be possible within the confines of the European Union. So we've seen some rolling back of the second pillar. We do have some pilot projects and social experiments and social clubs going on right now, but generally that's not an area where you're seeing a lot of growth. It's really this medical cannabis market, right? And even if you look market size wise, I mean, it's 20 tons was the amount that was imported in 2023. And based on the numbers that we're seeing this year alone, it's going to be over 100 tons. So that's a significant market share growth. Where is that being funneled from, right? It's really being funneled in a large extent from Canada because we do have these massive facilities, back to our earlier point, that are able to cultivate on scale, right? So I think that's what's happening. It's a little bit interesting to me that we've really only out of the US seen Curaleaf, get into the acquisition of 420 Pharma in Germany and Northern Green in Canada, really get into the international market. You haven't seen a lot of MSOs, but to me, it's a matter of time before you start to see more MSOs come on board because this kind of growth you're not even seeing in the US, right? There's no market even coming online that will see this sort of growth, and it's only growing upwards from here, and it's only one market, right? It's only Germany. We haven't even gotten in to the UK doing the same thing, or Poland doing the same thing. So it's there's many more markets within Europe to expand on.
Do you foresee an MSO going directly to Germany, or do you see them partnering with a Canadian company who's funneling to Germany?
Or there's the third option, right? Do they actually acquire someone? Because I think the challenge with the US approach so far has been if if I'm somebody that's not Curaleaf, like say Trulieve, I have an operation where I'm cultivating, I actually can't export that, to international markets. Well, I can't export that across state lines, and I certainly can't export that internationally. So I'm very limited to what I'm doing in the US. So the only way for me to go international is really two ways. One, I could do a brand licensing deal where I could certainly have my, whatever products in the international market, which we're seeing some of. Or if I'm a bigger kind of MSO, I can actually go out and acquire someone, right? And I think that's what's really interesting, is because the US capital markets and the Canadian capital markets are still an interesting way for some of these early founders to get liquidity. I think that is appealing. Like the currency that the US MSOs bring with them in terms of their paper is really interesting to, European and international cannabis operators, because again, the growth is only upwards. When the US deschedules, we've seen this over the last year, even based on rumors and announcements, stocks have really gone through the roof. So there's still that upside growth that companies and founders see on the international side, aligning themselves with US companies. In my opinion, I think we'll see more of the US MSOs actually start to go international.
What's the time frame if you had to just guess?
It's sort of like, when is the US going to deschedule cannabis?
Oh,
right?
never.
Those things. That's a cardinal question you never answer in the industry, because you just don't know.
There's this thing in the back of my mind. I was like, I just got to ask to see, is there a time frame? Because the companies are in the dumps right now. Like we talked about, the stock market's down so bad. So like an M&A approach right now could be difficult for them because there's just so many other challenges. But you're right. Like now is the time, with everyone hurting. There's growth at the table. The play was the right play. Yeah. The growth was the right approach. There was just other factors, right? And the result didn't work out, but the play was the right play and should be continue to run. But it is really difficult to achieve.
Yeah, I think if you look at like timing wise, honestly, I think right now would be the wrong time, just because everyone in Germany is in such hyper growth mode, and they're not wrong, because they're, doubling, tripling digit, their numbers every month over month. It's just, for them, obviously they're going to look at that and say, we're going to sustain this growth. But at some point, we know there's going to be that peak, right? In terms of how many patients can you realistically get on board. And I think probably a year from now is probably a good timeline to look back and say, Germany has now proven that the growth is 3x that it's been in the last 3 years. No other market's done that. It's now starting to cool down a little bit. Is it time to actually get into some of these markets? And I think it will be. I think, again, Curaleaf has done phenomenally well with their acquisition of 420 Pharma. It's a great company, and they're doing some great things on the international side.
It's really interesting to think about it, right? First in the industry, it felt like the Canadian companies, they got really big really fast, but they couldn't access the US markets, and then everyone kind of like poo-pooed them, and then they started growing tomatoes, and everyone shredded them. Then the US companies were the big ones, right? And now they're kind of trapped in the United States, and now the Canadian companies are back at the forefront because they have access to Germany. It's just kind of like a barbell approach, too, of like a swingy wheel. It's such an interesting dynamic to think about this just from the quick heritage we just talked about.
Yeah, also, if you look at us, right, like from a Canadian perspective, the longer that the US takes to do anything on this file, the better it is, right? We're just solidifying our pole position on the international markets, because as much as like you can talk about, Macedonia or South Africa, the quality isn't there. They'll get there. I'm not trying to say that they won't get there, but right now, for the next several years, the longer the US doesn't do anything, the better off we are, right? So you're not wrong in saying, Brian, that, some of these companies are now, Canadian companies are really starting to get back to being very active internationally. We saw that, right? You saw Tilray's earnings come out yesterday, and they did really badly in the Canadian market because they're losing market share, but they are doing well on the international market. And we're seeing the same thing. You look at Cannabis financials, Aurora's financials, Village Farms, it's all the same. Everyone's kind of moving towards that international side because they're starting to see this revenue. That number that I told you of the 20 to 100 tons is being filled mostly by Canadian companies, and that's where they're seeing the value. What that's doing in the domestic market is interesting, because now you've got a vacuum in the Canadian market of product that basically is being filled by the more craft, newer, kind of better products, if you will, for consumers. So it's really a win-win from a consumer standpoint also.
I also think, though, that like even if MSOs were to like flip the switch tomorrow, they're at an inherent disadvantage just from like a regulatory standpoint too, right? Like all of the Canadian facilities were built with Health Canada, like watching everything. They are already built to the same standards that EU GMP requires, right? So right. Like there's a simplicity associated with transferring product from Canada to Europe. And of course, it's not something that can't be tackled by MSOs, but like that's not something that you solve overnight, right? So like realistically, the longer it takes for the US to get on board, the more and more it just looks like the way in is through acquisitions then at that point.
That's a and that's a huge point, because I think people really underestimate the regulatory lift.
It's crazy.
Right? It's not just the GMP
It's crazy.
lift. It's even much further than that. Like Denmark doesn't allow you to use some pesticides, but Germany needs some specific microbials, and the UK has some other weird quirks, right? So it's almost like when you go into a cultivation facility, you actually have separate grow rooms for different markets, because that's how, from a regulatory standpoint, different each market is, right? And you layer that over and above, the FDA hasn't even regulated any of these facilities. They're operating on a state-by-state license approach, and states don't have the wherewithal to be able to have, GMP level compliance at these sites. So, and that works for the US, right? Much like in Canada, the Health Canada standards are not GMP or EU GMP level, but at least it's a higher standard than a state-by-state standard, right? It's easier to be able to go from that to a EU GMP side versus not. So, I think the US company is going to have a long time before they actually are going to be able to export, even if they were allowed with a change in schedule to be able to export. You're not going to see it happen overnight, and you're certainly going to need to have that manpower and that knowledge that's basically being developed in Canada now on how do you get this GMP product overseas, which is why you saw Curaleaf acquire Northern Green Canada. I mean, Northern Green Canada was a tiny company. Nobody really knew about it on the international scale, but Curaleaf saw it as a massive advantage, right? It wasn't just being able to take staff from the US into Canada or Germany and operate it. It was that expertise and knowledge of the NGC team.
Yeah, Boris was not shy about that. That was the asset that he wanted, and that exact reason, because he was like, I'm not doing that. Like, it's not worth that, because we can just buy this and go, which...
Yeah. And Brian, if you look at the numbers now, I mean, I was looking at some reports, and you look at the numbers of what NGC is actually putting out, it's significant. They've got a huge white labeling business where they do stuff for other people, but also selfishly are serving Curaleaf and 420 Pharma. And those numbers are pretty significant. I'd argue that acquisition is going to pay off for them in very short order.
That's good news. We like good news, right?
Yeah. the part that's frustrating for me, shout out to Curaleaf. That's an awesome move, right? To be the first mover there. The frustrating part is that, like, the US is just getting locked here, right? And international wise, Germany for sure exciting, numbers astronomical. But there's other countries too that I know you're really excited about that I'd love to hear you kind of share a little bit about.
Yeah, so absolutely. A lot of attention is usually paid to Germany, but like another market that's booming right now is really Australia. And Germany has been more dried flower just by way of the regulatory structure, and pharmacists actually having to compound product has limited kind of what you're seeing. You are starting to see some more what we call 2.0 products in Canada pick up in Germany, but a market that where it's really picked up is Australia. So you're starting to see gummies and live resin gummies and live resin vapes, and all of those kind of 2.0 products really gain steam in a market like Australia. So right now, there's tremendous opportunities for companies that have either a brand or have really good products like gummies and vapes that are in demand in the Australian market. So, that's one market that I'm very, very interested in. I'm operating in that market. There's a lot of really good companies that are doing some amazing stuff there. And same thing, you're starting to see other international markets open up. Israel still has, a thriving import market for Canadian cannabis producers. But then also you look at Poland, you look at Czech Republic. These are some other markets in the UK that are all importing products. And the UK too has now started to talk about pastilles or gummies. And, that's the sort of the next wave and the next set of the conversation that I'm following, because it is also from a regulatory standpoint a lot harder to get an EU GMP shatter or an EU GMP vape or EU GMP gummy into an international market, right? Flour is easy to be able to convert because it's an active ingredient. It's really not much to it. But when you start to get into a gummy and making a GMP, it's everything from inputs to processes to machinery to packaging to stability, right? So that's where the game gets really, really interesting, and there's limited companies that are playing in that pool.
Australia, are they limited, saying they only give out 10 total licenses, or is it that the rules and regulations say you need to achieve these things in order to operate, where the rules and regulations limit the total participants in the space?
It's the latter, and I wouldn't say they limit it. I think it is limited by way of the regulatory lift being so high that the number of players actually can't participate. But there's no arbitrage on licensing. There's no limit on how many people can import. Like, the government's very clear in Australia. The TGA says as long as you're complying with GMP standards, like you can send stuff in, right? So there's really no limit. It's just the number of companies that are able to do that is very, very small. because nobody has that GMP process, right? Like to try and get a gummy equipment validated and certified and all of that takes a lot of time and money. And so you're seeing very few companies do that. Aurora has done a great job on that side. They recently acquired a company out of Australia called Recreational, and that company is doing really well with that acquisition in servicing the Australian market. So you're starting to see, again, Canadian cannabis companies that have been making gummies here are now pivoted to GMP, are actually supplying, Australia and the UK that need these GMP products to be able to come in.
A lot of these are like medical, they're all medical markets. What is the conversation around recreational use? Is it kind of like completely ignored, or like people more warming up to it? Kind of, is each market its own little pocket?
Yeah, so I mean, there's two things. So on recreational, one, Switzerland's doing a really good job with their pilot projects. They've had pilot projects now for a few years. They've released some reports recently that's, again, say the world hasn't fallen and sky hasn't fallen really from an international perspective, which it needs to be said. The more countries that say it, I feel like people are listening. So certainly there's that piece. And now Switzerland's even gone further and said we're going to do a full Canada-style legalized program very soon. They're going to be debating it in the fall and coming out with legislation post that. So that's one market that, because they don't have the EU overhangs, because they're not technically part of the European Union, they can go out on a limb and make some things. So that's happening. That recreational cannabis conversation is happening. There's also a lot of like-minded countries that are smaller, Luxembourg, Malta, that are all having that same recreational conversation. I feel like it's still some time away before you see a full federal program like Canada has. And that, selfishly, if you're a Canadian company that's exporting, is great to see, because once you have a recreational program, we've seen in Canada, the medical market sort of, dies down a bit. So it's great to be able to service these international markets from Canada, because any trade, because of UN treaties, are only limited to medical and scientific purposes, meaning that I from Canada cannot export cannabis to a recreational market in Germany or in Switzerland. They would have to be domestically cultivated. So that sort of carve out is great, that the adult use conversation isn't progressing at lightning speed in some of these other countries, which allows us to be able to gain market share, right? And from a consumer perspective in Germany, it's so easy now to be able to get a prescription. You go online, you basically talk to a doctor, you actually step into a pharmacy, they do the teleconsult for you, you actually walk out with your product. So it's de facto legalized, if you will, even though it's a medical program.
It's so interesting, right? The regulatory could be a strategic advantage because the hoops in order to achieve can separate the people that can operate in those markets, but also the strategic advantage kind of goes in waves, right? Currently, Health Canada, boom, has set the bar so high that these Canadian companies are now able to operate in Europe and take advantage, which maybe not the right word, but strategize and utilize their resources to achieve all these assets, which again, I continue to believe that the tobacco companies, understanding that tobacco is going down and seeing all these other growth, could continue to try to gobble up and say, okay, we need to be here and here, because if we can connect these pieces of the puzzle, we now have the full global scale to operate across the globe.
Yeah, no, fully agree, Brian. And we're starting to see more and more of that, happening now. I think, you look at Organigram and the moves that they're making. Again, it's a classic example of that happening. And I think Organigram is not the only company. You'll start to see more of that happen across the board.
Do you think that they'll feel more and more comfortable being public with some of these elements, or do you think they're already public and just about people just might not be noticing?
It's the latter. I think there's a lot already out there. There obviously is some hesitation by some of these companies, particularly when you look at the political landscape. I mean, lobbying, particularly alcohol, tobacco, is an issue. I mean, there's legislation around that. So there certainly is reason to be, cautious and skeptical if I'm one of those companies. But you are starting to see more and more of that happen. I think people are just not connecting all the dots necessarily, and it's not as open as the Organigram BAT stuff is. But there certainly is more and more out there now.
It probably won't be as open until there's demonstrated or a precedent that, hey, being open about it also benefits our stock over here as well.
Well, exactly.
That's my guess, right?
Yeah, exactly. Also, Caleb, remember there's international issues, right? And BAT actually has managed to solve this well, but the UK has something called the Proceeds of Crime Act. And basically what that means is if an activity is illegal in the UK, it's illegal everywhere. So if you're a UK business any, that activity is illegal elsewhere. It wasn't really written for cannabis, but cannabis is caught up into this this thing, this Proceeds of Crime Act. And so, BAT is having to keep whatever profits are being made at Organogram within that entity so as not to be offside and not bring it back to the UK. So there are still international kind of investing and other regulations that actually need to change before you'll start to see, this happen en masse. And because these companies are also public, some of them will be hesitant from that perspective because they don't want their bank account shut down, right? Yeah. And again, the US, the US domino not falling is a big issue because U.S. banking has quite significant overreach on the international side, right? You don't want to start to deal in U.S. dollars because even if you're UK dealing with Canada and you're dealing in U.S. currency, now suddenly you're subject to U.S. law, even though you've never actually crossed borders or been into the U.S. So there's a lot of implication on that the U.S. kind of, criminalization of cannabis has on the international markets.
Do you think there's a possibility that the tobacco companies could operate from like a FOMO model and say, hey, we saw this company's making these moves, they're acquiring a bunch of these good assets, we should look to acquire X, Y, and Z in order to solidify the protection of potential revenue gains in the future?
Yeah, I think you've seen that, right? Again, I think the Motif Labs acquisition by OGI was exactly that piece that you're talking about, Brian. I think the strategies for other companies may be a little bit different. I think it's really depending on what your strategy is and how it fits. I mean, for Organogram, because it's a very public company that's involved in the recreational market and they want to see themselves solidified as a number one pole position on market share, that acquisition made sense. For other companies, it may be more of a medical focused or maybe more of a wellness focus, and you'll see potential acquisitions around that, right? I think where we are at this stage of the game is people are quite savvy in understanding you're not just doing an acquisition for the sake of it, just to be able to get a license or to be able to, enter the market. That was a 2018, 2017 thing. I think now it's more like, how does this actually add value to what I'm doing? And if I'm one of these companies, if I'm trying to develop a product and suddenly you can show me bioavailability is going through the roof, I may be interested in looking at that if that's my specific challenge.
So how then, when these clients contact you, do you feel comfortable making these recommendations knowing that it's like left or right, then it's like two lefts to the right? Because there's so many moving pieces, there's so many variables, and there's so many dependings on based on the information that they perceive. So it has to be a very detailed, it's not as easy as they give you information and you provide an answer. It has to be a rigorous, thorough process before kind of providing a suggestion.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of that fine tuning of strategy at the outset, right? Like, what do you want to do? It's almost also like GMP. I have people come to me and say they want GMP. And my first question is why? If you're operating in the Canadian market, it makes zero sense for you to have the overheads of operating a GMP facility. So it's the same conversation with a bigger CPG company. It's like, what do you intend to achieve? I get that you want to be in cannabis. I get that maybe your business is dying, but what specifically do you want to achieve? Is revenue generation important to you? How important is regulation to you? Because it's not a question of if, it's a question of how much, right? So, are there things like the Proceeds of Crime Act in the UK that are going to stop you? Are there issues around certain US markets that you may not want to touch because of federal illegality, right? So there's all of these layers that go into that decision-making process. And when you come out of that, you finally have a refined strategy on, okay, this is exactly where my right to win is. This is what I want to target. And now how do I go about achieving that? So that's, I think, where I'm able to add value. But there is a really important discussion around going through all of those different challenges before you can get to what it is that you're after.
The timeline for that's got to be like maybe a couple months or a year, maybe, right? Because there's probably conversations and they're like, I don't believe you, Deepak. That can't really be a thing. And you're like, come check it out. Let me show you. And then you got to go back to the drawing board, right? So is it that kind of a typical timeline? And that's like what you explain to them from an expectation standpoint?
Absolutely. And I think there's like the FOMO, as I said earlier, is gone. So there's no major rush to doing something, to getting something out. At least some of the companies that I'm dealing with, there's none of that, right? So that really helps, right? I think that's where you really divide the cannabis companies from the non-cannabis companies, because the cannabis companies are very much about this quarter, what's my revenue, how do I boost international? So I've got it's two subsets of customers, really. One that really is interested in that piece, and the other is kind of looking at the more long-term view and horizon.
Is there ever any conversations where the strategies kind of like intersect and where they're kind of going against each other, where you're like, well, we don't want this to happen, and then this person from this department, because these companies are large, they've got massive revenues. Is there any conversations where they recognize that one part of the business that they want to grow might be hurting another part of their business?
I mean, I haven't come across that yet, but there's got to be, right? I mean, I'm not involved in that detail with some of these companies, but I mean, that's got to happen. I'm sure it's inevitable that will be the case.
How do you balance, like, say, like, two clients, similar other backgrounds, kind of want the same outcome, and yet you get to have like conversations? How does that work? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I get your question. I mean, it's more.
Wasn't a very.
He's a kingmaker.
Well formulated. I didn't finish it because I was like.
No, I get your question. I mean, it's it's all about what the strategy might be and differentiating, and not doing the same thing necessarily for two different companies. It's like that, especially in cannabis, right? You've got multiple clients that are effectively doing the same thing. They're cultivating and selling cannabis. The conflict is more real on the cannabis side, but I think where companies are, everyone's kind of found their niche. One client may be really large cultivator that's doing stuff at scale. The other one may be really small that's just got craft cannabis. Those are two completely different products categories, right? From that perspective, or somebody may be doing flower versus someone's doing vapes or gummies. Again, totally different segments, right? So that's kind of how I balance some of my stuff on my side.
Are the international countries looking at the U.S. being like hemp, cannabis, state-by-state challenges, federally? Like, are they looking at us just like in disbelief and say, we shouldn't make these mistakes, we should understand that the plan is the plan? Or are they just kind of completely ignoring us and saying, listen, they're chaotic, they're United States, leave them alone?
Well, there's so many levels on that answer.
Take it the way you want.
Do you really want to know how the international market feels in the US right now? Look, from a Canadian standpoint, I mean, the US kind of hemp stuff and where the Farm Bill was, particularly around the Delta 8 stuff, is not gone unnoticed. I think a lot of countries have realized that they need to get ahead of this, and they don't want to have that same Farm Bill loophole happen to them. So they don't want these new cannabinoids, which seem to come out every other day. And here's a new cannabinoid that does the same thing that Delta 9 does, but it's derived from hemp. Like, you don't have any of that stuff. So I think countries are getting proactive on shutting it down and saying, any other cannabinoids besides CBD, isn't really regulated or would be regulated the same as THC. Canada did that very early on, but you are starting that particular lesson. I think has resonated. I think Europe's had a massive HHC issue in the past, and so they've woken up and realized they need to start to ban this very quickly. And we saw at the UN level most recently that HHC was put on the banned list, right? So they actually consider that to be very similar to THC, so it was put into the UN side of things and started to be banned at that level. So countries are starting to pay attention to the US. I think from a cannabis policy perspective, obviously the US is not a market to emulate because there isn't really a federal market, but it's not lost that models like California and even Canada to a large extent, you look at what's worked, what hasn't worked, and take the goods and the bads, right? I always like to tell governments and regulators that I meet that, cannabis legalization, it's a process. It's not an event. It's not a date. You don't just legalize cannabis and then you're done with it, right? You have to constantly go back to see what worked, what didn't work, and kind of adjust things. And I think that's the exciting part for me as I look at international governments and some of the advice that I do there, is that there still isn't a perfect model, right? I think the US actually has a tremendous opportunity to have learnings from each state and apply that at a federal level. But also from a Canadian standpoint, you've got that opportunity. What worked, what didn't work? Let's try and build this well.
I can only hope. So take us through the GCRS event in DC that you recently attended. What do we need to know that happened there?
Yes, I think, the Artemis Group put that together with a company called the Liaison Group, Safira Gulab, who I think you've had on the show before. And so, Safira's got some great contacts in DC. And so I think what we did was we brought people from all over the world to Washington, DC, and to we had meetings at the Senate and the Congress kind of area, and kind of actually, talked to a few senators and legislators there just to make them aware of what's happening with cannabis on the international stage. And so there was a lot of interesting conversations happening around the legalization of cannabis on the international level, and really just educating Washington, D.C., around that, if you will.
Were they receptive? Like, was it a very welcoming? They were like taking notes. Like, how were those conversations?
Yeah, I'd say there was definitely a lot of interest. We had, a few senators come by and even speak. I mean, the key there is to be able to convert people that aren't already converted.
Yeah.
I mean, that's sort of the goal. And I think what's coming out of the GCRS is basically that there are going to be white papers that are put out. And the hope is that those white papers would then get read by more members of Congress and more senators to be able to start to realize what's happening on the international side. Because so far, it's been a very U.S.-centric conversation, right? How is this impacting my constituents? Or you've had people that are, going to their senators and congressmen and actually telling them what their challenges are. But now you've got these international body basically coming to you and saying, here's how it's working in Denmark and Netherlands and Australia and Canada, and here are some things that are working and not working. So it's good to be able to put that out there, and I think there'll be a lot of attention on those white papers.
Are there conversations where they're surprised to hear kind of some of the information, to recognize that there's other countries doing it way better?
Absolutely. There's definitely that, but also there's the U.S. perspective, right? Because I think, there's been so much going on between the FDA and the DEA. We had the ex-head of the FDA actually do a keynote the lunch session, and, she said a lot of these things were put into recommendations by the FDA, but obviously the DEA now needs to act on that. So, there certainly is some awakening by people that are naive to cannabis, but when you look at people within the FDA or the DEA, I mean, they're not naive to this. They've been looking at what's happening internationally for quite some time. I mean, the FDA did a great job putting that paper together for the DEA, right, on their opinion of where cannabis scheduling should go. So I think there's a lot more, politically from the bureaucracy that needs to still happen in the U.S. And I think that's where really the rubber's going to have to hit the road if you want to see real change.
Do you see any catalysts in like the next 5-6 months that could help facilitate some of that change?
Well, there's that video that recently came out. I don't know if you guys saw it, about bashing Canadian companies and how we're taking over the U.S. And I think that seems to resonate with the resident in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. So maybe that will be a catalyst to be able to say, hey, the Canadians are taking over the world, on both from a capital markets perspective and also from just a pure revenue standpoint. So maybe that will resonate. Hopefully that will be a catalyst.
Elon's not showing that on our feeds.
Well, Elon's way out, I think. So
1 year from now, what has changed?
Look, 1 year from now, I think that you've got a robust, thriving German medical cannabis market. You've got, international markets that have picked up. I think the UK is probably the next domino to really open up from a medical legalization perspective. It's been one that hasn't fully matured. But I see more and more countries looking at legalizing cannabis, at least for medical purposes, right? And I think that's where really, truly a lot of the international trade opportunities are. Because of UN treaties, you can have trade around non-medical products. So I think that for me is really what I'm looking forward to in the next year.
I love it. So for Deepak, for our listeners, they want to get in touch, they want to explore international, and they need your help. Where can they find you?
Quite active on Twitter and LinkedIn, so happy to reach out to me on either of those channels.
Cool. We'll link it all in the show notes. Thanks for taking the time. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you for having me.